Hey everyone, and welcome to the Joomlashack conference. I'm delighted to have Johan with us. Many of you were with us, I think, back in April when Johan presented Joomlatools Pages, and that was probably one of the top 2 or 3 sessions we've ever done. It ran over, people had tons of questions. They were really excited to see what Johan had developed with Joomlatools Pages. And in this session, he's come back to put it into a larger context. What were the problems that we were trying to solve maybe 20 or 30 years ago and are still sometimes trying to solve now? And how is the work that he's doing now with static page generators a kind of natural evolution of what's gone before? So Johan, welcome.
Thank you. So I have a little bit of a story to tell. So I'm going to go over basically going to go back in time to 1990 when like everything started and take you through like it's end of the year, it's 15 years Joomla. So I wanted to combine all that, like a little bit of history and a little bit of fun facts and a little bit of technology. So I want to start with a quote from Einstein: "An intelligent fool can make things bigger and more complex. It takes a touch of genius and a lot of courage to move in the opposite direction." And I think that's like where the web has gone in the last, let's call it 10 years. We have been adding more and more complexity. Like if you only look at Joomla, Joomla has become more and more complex. Components have been more and more complex. It has become more and more complex to set up websites. So the question and the challenge that I was trying to figure out is there actually a way to go back, right? Can we get the same simplicity that we had in the very beginning, but still have all the power that we're used to today? And that's kind of like the problem and the answer for this talk. So we will start at the beginning. We will start at what we call, actually these slides are created, or the concept of the slides is a brainstorm we did at Joomlatools. Wasim, one of our consultants, has helped me with it. So the idea here is that we go through 5 phases of web development. And we begin at the very beginning with the HTMLolithic area, when there was only HTML, right? And when you wanted to put something online, it was quite simple. You had to create a HTML page. So you had to know a little bit of HTML, and you wrote it in your notepad, you put it on a server, and you had a web page. And we're going all the way back to 1991. Actually, in 1991, Tim Berners-Lee published the very first web page. It was published in August 1991 at CERT. This is probably a story you all know. And the page is still online. It's a little bit older. It wasn't the very first one, but this is the link. If you use this link, you can actually go to that original page that Tim published. For the people that are now rushing to find it, I made a copy for you. So here it is. This is the very, very first web page. A little bit of text, nothing more, no images yet, nothing complex. And links, like links to different documents and to different pages that explained what the World Wide Web, as it was called, was all about, how it worked, and how you could join and start publishing on the World Wide Web yourself. So when we publish, we had to use something called a markup language. We had to have something that would allow a machine, a computer, to understand what everything meant, right? Are you publishing a header? Are you publishing a paragraph? Is it a list? So we had to have something for that, which we call the hypertext markup language. Why I'm putting this in? Because it starts making sense a little bit later when we start talking about PHP. The link here is to the HTML spec, the HTML 2.0 spec. HTML 1.0 was created by Tim and wasn't really published online. There is no official specification for HTML1, but there's an official specification for HTML2, which is the following link. So here is a very, very simple example. And this is the example that I will be using along this talk to show you all the different steps that we have gone through from 1990 till now. So this is an example in HTML2. Very simple, a header with a title, the title of my page, and a list of links. Everybody should be a little bit technical, so should know a little bit what this is. And if you don't, no worries, I won't go too much in detail. But what you see here is actually HTML2. You see that the tags are still capitals. Right now we use like lowercase tags, but they were uppercase. And there's also no closing tag for the LE. The LE basically means the list element. So there's no closing for that. It's just LE, and then there is an A tag, which is a link behind it. So these are 5 links to 5 different articles. That's it. What is important here, and what I want to start with and then evolve from, are different features. This specific HTML page has, I have 7 features, right? It's a single file, meaning that I could put this single HTML file on a web server and it will work. It's not dynamic. I need to create it manually. It's not separated. That basically means there is no separation between the data and the HTML yet. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. There is no data source being used. It's just a static HTML file. The cool thing about this is that I can copy paste it. I can just write it locally in my notepad, and then I can copy paste it using FTP on my server, and it would just work. Because of that, and because of the way the web works, it's also cacheable. And then later on, this will make a lot of sense for the Joomla people. For those that don't know Joomla that much, it will make less sense. There is no item ID here, and this is the dreaded item ID that Joomla has, and how Joomla works, which is talked about quite a lot. So 3 key features: single file, copy, paste, and cacheable. Very, very, very easy and very, very simple. So we go to our next phase. Our next phase is what we call the Dynamolithic area, which is when we started asking ourselves, like, this is really, really cool, right? We have HTML, we can publish on the internet, we can create HTML documents, we can put them on a server, and people can just access them and can consume the information. But it's very time consuming. It's very, very time consuming to manually write the HTML. We need web developers for that to write it and put it online. What if we could make the generation of that HTML a little bit more dynamic? What if we could have a computer generate the HTML for us so that we don't need to generate it all by hand? Like, for example, what I just showed you, you have a list of 6 links. What if those 6 links could be generated automatically, right? And if I add more links are being generated. So this is the Dynamolithic area. This is when we started evolving from static HTML into dynamic HTML and dynamic applications. And this is also 4 years later when PHP gets announced. And PHP, for people that might not know, but PHP was officially called PHP-FI. It was built by Rasmus Lerdorf, and he announced in 1994, he announced what he called the Personal Homepage Form Interpreter, or PHP-FI. It's basically, the idea was that, okay, I'm writing all this static HTML. This is really great. I have my personal web page, my personal website. Now I want to be able to automate that and make it more dynamic so that I need to do less work, and the web server can do more work for me. So what he wanted to do was build simple dynamic web applications. And this is actually the start of where we are still today, in a sense, right? The creation of dynamic web applications. And he announced PHP-FI version 1 in 1995, which is 25 years ago. For those who weren't around back then, this is actually a little bit of code of PHP FI 1 and 2, actually. This is November 1997. This looks very, very different than the PHP that we're used to today. This was just a way of making your HTML dynamic. What you can see here is an include. So we're going to include another HTML file. You can see an if statement, and you can see a sort of database select query, like SQL database select from table where username, and then see if that record exists. And if not, print welcome user. You have so many credits in your account, and then a footer. So this is basically dynamic. I'm going to include different HTML files. I'm going to make a call to a database, and I'm going to render HTML. This is very, very different from what PHP would become later. And this is also because Rasmus initially wasn't intending to write a programming language. Like, PHP was never intended to be that. It by accident became a programming language. But he didn't really want to do that. He just wanted to create something dynamic to make to be lazy. Like, we all are a little bit lazy as developers, so we want to create tools that allow us to do less, so we can go to the Bahamas and sip on our cocktails. And that, in a sense, which PHP was also about. But then people started picking up on it, and Ziv Zaretsky and Andy Goodmans are the two people that actually created PHP 3, which forms the basis of the PHP that we know today. They started working on that in 1999, and they released PHP 4 in 2000. And then when we switch to the next step, you will see that very closely after, that formed the basis of many of the web applications, especially open source web applications that we know today. WordPress, Joomla, Mambo, different forum applications that were all built on this version of PHP and powered by Zend Engine 1.0, which is what Ziv and Andy wrote. The name changed a little bit. The name changed to hypertext preprocessor. And this is very important because we just talked about hypertext, we just talked about HTML, and now we have a preprocessor, something that can generate hypertext dynamically so that I don't need to create it manually. That was the idea. So here we have a very, very simple, the same example as before. Before we had like a static list of a couple of links. Here we're going to create the same list, but we're going to do this with HTML4 and with PHP 4. We're making a connection to a database. We're doing a query here, and this is happening here, the query. And then we're printing the results in HTML, and that's it. So this is a single file dynamic web application, right? Rendering a list of links to articles. If the database would contain more articles, the list would get longer. So it becomes dynamic. The developer doesn't need to change it anymore. The application will do that automatically, dynamically. So we have here in features, and those features are the ones that are important. We have a single file. This is it. It's dynamic. We're using PHP. There's no separation of logic yet. We'll talk about that later. We are using a very specific data source, which is MySQL. And this is copy pastable. You can copy paste this, put it on a web server that has PHP installed, put the database in place, and it will just work. It is technically cacheable. However, at that time, we were not really considering caching on the internet. We were rendering and re-rendering this list each time the page was being requested. And item IDs, well, Joomla wasn't a thing yet, and Mambo wasn't a thing yet, so item IDs didn't come into play. Single file, dynamic, single data source, and you could copy paste it. So this was our second step. This was our dynamic step. We went from static HTML to dynamic HTML. And this is all great, right? So now we have a web developer that can be lazy and that can create a system that automatically will generate a web page. We're talking a lot about page generators and static page generators today, and this is a little bit like a new buzz term. However, go back 30 years, 20 years in time to the year 2000, and this is exactly what we're doing, right? This is what PHP is all about. PHP, call it the grandfather of static page generators. So, you know, somewhere, somehow, that whole idea behind PHP got a little bit lost in translation and lost across the decades. Next step. So the next step we call the Webpublolithic area. So what we have now is we have developers that could create dynamic web applications, and that's really great. But it's still a developer thing, right? So we then wanted to be able to add content to the site, and we wanted to be able to do that in such a way that also non-developers could write and publish content and articles on the internet. So we had to have a more complex system. We had to have a web publishing system. I'm not calling it CMS yet. That's a term that probably comes a little bit later. Let's call it a web publishing system. We had to have a tool that could both render the HTML that people would see, the front end, and we had to have a tool that could allow people to log in and author and edit content through a backend, the backend application, the administrator in Joomla. Dynamic website was the previous step. Dynamic web application, web publishing system is this step. And we're talking about 2002-ish, when Mambo open source was first announced. And you see this follows very closely, right? We have PHP 4 announced in 2000, people starting to work with it, starting to recognize the power of it. And only 2 years later, there is Mambo open source, which is the predecessor of Joomla that was announced. And then a little bit of history. This I took from the Wikipedia page. I think it's probably almost correct. There might be some mistakes here, but then again. So Mambo was created in March 2000 in Melbourne, in Australia. It was closed source. And the company that created it, Miro, put it on SourceForge. And SourceForge is a source code. It's like the GitHub of 2000. Let's call it like that. They put it under the GPL license on SourceForge in April 2001. Still 2001 and 2002, they were the ones making most of the changes. And it's at the end of 2002 that a small open source community grew around Mambo. And that Robert Castley, which was the original project director, grew a small team. And they released Mambo open source 3.0. This is actually also, if you still remember where the name MOS comes from. MOS was referred to as Mambo open source or MOS. And this is the actual initial seed of what later would become Joomla. So here's our next step. So this is Mambo 4.5. I don't have code from Mambo 3. I looked, but I don't have it, so I cannot show you how it worked there. But this is Mambo 4.5, and in a sense also Joomla 1.0. So this is how a list of web links, the same list of web links will be rendered. You can see that there's a little bit more complexity here. There's some PHP code here. There's a class and a function, HTML web links, display list. So we're going to display a list of web links, and then you have HTML code with some PHP in here. What you don't find here is the actual calls to the database. The calls to the database to get the data from the database are not here anymore. They are done somewhere else, and then the two are combined. I have included the different files. So this is not a single file solution anymore. I now need multiple files to make this happen. I have a weblinks.php file, which is the entry file for what we call the component now. Com stands for component. So this is a block of functionality, a component. I have a weblinks.php file. We have a weblinks HTML file that actually renders the HTML. This is where this code comes from. And then we have a weblinks.class. That is the part that actually handles the connection with the database, getting the data out of the database and then injecting it here. You can see there's a categories variable and a rows variable on top in the display list function. This is where the data gets injected and then gets rendered. So this is not a single file anymore. We now need 3 files to make this work. It's dynamic. It's not separated yet. Separated here means that the actual HTML and the programming logic is separated, and that's not the case here. They're still intermingled. I cannot easily make changes to how this HTML is being rendered. So there is no separation of logic. I'm using a single data source. I can copy paste it. And this was one of the cool things about Mambo in the beginning, was that this component weblinks didn't need to be installed. Actually, there was no component installer. So you didn't have a package, a zip file that you could download from somewhere that you would upload. You would download a zip file, or you would download a couple of files, and you would simply upload them through FTP on the server in the right folder. So here you have a weblinks folder with the code in. So this is actually copy-pastable code. There is no additional steps needed to make this work. It's not cacheable. Joomla today still isn't cacheable because Joomla basically assumes that each time this list is being rendered, the server receives a new request and will re-render the page. So there is no caching being considered. There is a yes, but let's assume that by default, this is non-cacheable. This is also what Joomla does, right? Joomla basically says, I'm not cacheable. And there are no item IDs yet in Mambo. Well, there are, but not really yet. And this is a little bit where that item ID comes from, right? Because this is probably the most debated and the heavily debated topic in the Joomla world. This is the dreaded item ID. The item ID is simply nothing more than the ID of the menu item. When you create a Joomla website, you will create menu items that go along your page so people can click on, and each of those menu items has an ID, which is the item ID. Originally, Mambo didn't require those item IDs. And originally, Mambo also didn't have a hierarchical menu system. This was it. The only thing that you could do in Mambo 4 is you could link to a component. This is a single link to a component. You could link to different sections of content, and you could link to a URL or a separator, and that was it. These were all the options that you have. So right now, we are used to linking to a component, and we can decide where specifically we link to, and we have different settings that we can set. In the beginning, these were the only options. And specifically to linking to a component, you were just linking to the component itself, and you could create one link to that component, not multiple links. Go a little bit back, right? Imagine how this was created. You had a company that was creating websites for small and mid-sized businesses, and they were creating the same functionality each time, again and again and again. They were creating web links on the site, a contact form on the site, a news feeds overview. They had to publish content on the site. So what they were doing was they were creating all these little PHP scripts, probably, but I'm not sure, but I think they did. They actually used Dreamweaver to create those. The reason I assume that is because the initial JavaScript that came with Mambo was actually JavaScript generated by Dreamweaver. So they used Dreamweaver to write their PHP, and then they created this, what they called components, which are functional blocks, web links, news feeds, menus, etc. And then they had this very small menu item system that you could link to a component, and that was it. So we didn't really have item IDs yet here. They came later. This is Mambo 4.5, and then you see that we have a couple more options. We can now link to a contact item, a newsfeed, static content, a URL. So we have also different layouts. We have a block layout, and we have a table layout. So there's a couple more options that are happening here. And here we're also starting to use more the item ID concept, not really yet. Why do I know that? Because I was the developer that created a hierarchical menu system for Mambo. One of the very first components that I wrote was actually a new menu manager for Mambo that was hierarchical and that starting to use the concept of the item ID. The item ID was already there, but it wasn't really exposed in the URL to load the right menu item. So I'm kind of responsible for that. So sorry about that. So next step. So now we had web publishing, right? So we had a front end dynamic website, and we had a back end administrator. We had developers that could use the dynamic front end to generate the HTML, and we had users that could use an authoring environment administrator to input their content. But we had a problem, right? The problem was that the business logic, the logic that was used to render the content on the front end and the actual HTML that was used to render that content were not separated. So there was no clear separation between both. So it was not completely separated yet. And that wasn't ideal because we wanted to be able to create a different layout for different sites. So the layout in the HTML shouldn't really be fixed, which was the case in Mambo. And if you still remember, Mambo still used tables, right? It didn't use, it was not a tableless design, which was a huge thing back then. So we had to take a next step. And the next step was the evolution of the publishing system to the CMS. And the CMS is all about separation of content and presentation. This is the key here. In Joomla 1.5, we used a model view controller design pattern to achieve that. But there are different ways you could do it. But the whole idea is, how can I separate content and presentation? So the presentation and the presentation logic is what is being used to generate my HTML. The content logic is the logic and the code that is being used to input and process that content. And you want to have those as separate as possible. You don't want to include your database calls in your file that renders your HTML. That won't work. well, it works, but it's not separated, and then you cannot override it. The additional advantage of separating both is that you can also output the same content or the same content in different formats. For example, you could easily render RSS from that data, because RSS is just a different presentation. It's a different way of presenting the same data. So that brings us to YPKJ 2008, after the fork in 2005, and all the hard work for 2.5 years. We released Joomla 1.5.0 in 2008. And from then on, you could start talking about a CMS. The Joomla 1.0, in my view, never really was a CMS. It never really separated logic properly. But Joomla 1.5 at least tried to do that. That was the whole goal. And that was also clear from the original announcement that we wrote. This is the release announcement, or parts of the release announcement of Joomla 1.5. Not going to read all of it, but very clear that we wanted to point out that this release announcement was that we worked very, very hard on separating programming logic from presentation logic. So whatever made the data input work from whatever made the HTML rendering or the presentation rendering work. And this is really, really key, because once we did this, it became possible to get almost complete control over the output of Joomla. And this resulted in all the different template clubs and all the different templates and all the visual diversity that was created. Basically, by the changes that we did in Joomla 1.5, we bootstrapped the whole industry, like a whole set of business models and industries around template businesses that were creating templates for Joomla. Additionally, we also made it so that you could output your content in different formats. You could output it as RSS. You could even output it as PDF, something that Joomla 1.5 supported, and of course as HTML. And finally, the separation of logic and presentation wasn't only there for template developers. We know that as template overrides and the whole template override system, but it was also there for component developers, people that wanted to create components for Joomla. And there was also separation of logic and presentation there by the introduction of the MVC, which stands for Model View Controller. I'm not going to go in technical detail what it means, but what you need to remember here is that the whole idea behind Model View Controller is that separation. And you can read the rest of the announcement, which is actually a nice walk back through down to memory lane from quite some years ago already. On the link below, it's still out there. Now, things get a little bit more complex here. This is Joomla 1.5, and this is the same list of web links that we have been showing in the different steps, but now being rendered through a Model View Controller component. What you see on the left is the actual template to render the list. This is what a template designer could override. As you can see, there is a little bit of PHP in here, but mainly this is HTML. On the right, you see all the different files that are needed to make this component work. And this is only the front end. This is only the front end part. So you see the controller, you see the models. We have a model for web links, categories, category and categories. You see the views. I haven't opened all of them because otherwise it wouldn't fit, but this is all the different files for the category view. And if you go into category TMPL, you actually find the template, and that one you see on the left. Then a little bit down, you see view.feed.php. This is the rendering of the RSS feed for the list of web links. So it became possible to also render the data as RSS. And then you see view.html.php, which is the basis for rendering the HTML. We have another controller, a main controller. We have a router. And this is where the whole routing and item ID comes in. We need to start generating URLs. We want to have clean URLs, so we need the concept of routing. This is the router. And then the weblinks.php file is the entry file. This is where Joomla basically calls into, when you start this component, Joomla will open up, will call into the weblinks.php file, and then the component takes control of Joomla in a sense. The component is always the master and is always in control, which is different than actually how WordPress works. But that's a different topic. But in architecture, both systems are quite different. So here we have the web links component, and on the left, the rendering of a list of web links. Now, for our list of features, this is not single file anymore, far from, right? So there is a lot of complexity that comes in here to really create that separation. We need to put things in the proper places. And as developers, we also need to understand how all that works. So there is more complexity and more knowledge required to build a MVC component for Joomla 1.5. It's dynamic, of course. We're using PHP. And there is clear separation of logic. The presentation logic that you see on the left is clearly separated from all the rest. All the other logic that makes this component work is clearly separated from this list, from rendering of this list. We're only using a single data source. There's only MySQL database behind it. And the copy pasting starts to fail. We can copy paste the template overrides. And that is what designers would do. That would work. This is a new feature we added. But the component itself is not copy pastable anymore. It needs to be installed. You need to create a zip file. You need to add a specific XML file to it that explains to Joomla how to install it. So it becomes harder, right? There is more barriers that are being put in place to make all of this work. And then, of course, we are introducing the dreaded item ID for Joomla to know which link to call and what information to give to this web links component. There's an item ID that is needed. And how does that work? Well, here you have your add menu item. You can now add much more menu item types, and the menu item manager ties in to the component. It knows which different views that are available. And if you would click on web links, you would open up a box that shows all of those, and you click on one, and then you get different options that you can fill in. So for each link that I'm now creating, I can, for example, create a link to a list of web links. But I could also create a link to all my web link categories. I can create different kinds of links. I'm also generating an item ID, and Joomla requires that item ID to know how and to specifically what component to execute and what data to give to that component so that the component will start doing the right thing. I found a very interesting link about browsing around from 2006 below, Joomla 1.5.blogspot.com. Not sure who created this, but it's really nice. There is an overview, an evolution overview from Mambo 4, Mambo 4.5, Joomla 1.0, and Joomla 1.5 in terms of evolution from different aspects of the administrator. And he also has this nice overview on this link about the changes that were made to the menu item manager. So this is where item ID, in a sense, comes from, right? We are not only linking to a single component, or we are not only linking to the component like we did in Mambo 4, we're now linking to a specific view, and we're telling Joomla specifically what information to show. Is it the list of web links? Is it the list of categories for those web links? Is it a single web link? What do you want to see on your site? So the last step, right? So the last phase is what I call the Pageolitic phase. Well, we had to give it a nice name, and this sounded quite nice. With this, we don't mean the Pageolitic area in the development of man, right? This is a completely different thing. This is purely technical. This is simply about the web. Somebody pointed out to me on chat yesterday that I could get myself into sort of political trouble with the term, but to make it clear. So where we are right now, where we're moving into right now is we're moving basically back. We are going back where we come from. We are now focusing again on the concept of dynamic page generation. We now have MVC. We have separation of presentation, business logic and presentation logic. But what we also want is we want to be able to be source agnostic. We don't only want to connect to a database. We also want to connect to other data sources and to render data from those data sources. So we want to use MySQL database, but we also want to get data from a file system or even from a web service. We want to use a page generator to generate that data. In this era where we're kind of like now in, we also don't want to limit ourselves to just HTML and RSS. We want to go further than that. We want to easily be able to render CSVs, which is the basis for spreadsheets, an Excel spreadsheet, or we want to generate a JSON API that would allow us to connect our web application with, for example, a mobile app, or connect web applications together so that two machines can talk to each other. So we can only do that. We can only get here when we achieve the separation. So the MVC structure is really key to being able to do this. If you put everything together and it becomes like one bowl of spaghetti, this won't work. But because we achieved the MVC and we separated everything, we can now take a next step and we can start thinking about different kinds of output formats. And in a sense, this is what Pages is all about. Right? Pages is a dynamic page generator. It's not a static page generator. So in 2000, which is April, I announced Joomlatools Pages, which is something that I've been working on now almost for 3 years. And that takes a lot of history into account, not putting it into this presentation, but basically Pages builds on a decade of work. After Joomla 1.5, I started working on a new framework, which some of you might know. It was called Nuku framework. That framework forms the basis of all our Joomlatools components today. It actually also forms the basis of our WordPress components. We have recently built Docman for WordPress. So it's actually the same code base. The same code base for Docman and Joomla, the same code base for Docman and WordPress, and the same code base for Joomlatools Pages is all the same base framework. On top of that framework, I've started working on a dynamic page generator. Again, this is not a new concept, right? I'm basically going back to what PHP initially was all about. Generating HTML in a very simple way so that I could easily publish my HTML on my website. So Joomlatools Pages, I call it a page generator. It's inspired by ideas and concepts of flat file CMS systems like Graph and static site generators. I'm not trying to, this is not a new idea. This is just combining all those ideas and make the wheel roll smoother in a sense. What Pages is not, it's not a static site generator. A static site generator is a system that will generate all the HTML for a whole site, put it somewhere on your file system locally, so that you can then upload it either automatically or manually through FTP to your web server. So with a static site generator, the idea is that you generate your whole site. If you make a change to the site, you need to regenerate the whole site. Pages doesn't work like that. Pages generates a single page at a time, just like PHP 2 in the very beginning worked, and it still works like that. So it works dynamic, it's lazy, and I try to make it smart so that it knows what content is being used on the page it's generating, where the content is coming from, and when the content has changed. Now, something that I've noticed that people got a little bit wrong maybe is that Pages is not about Markdown. It's not about a flat file system where you can put Markdown files on and you can publish those on your site. It can do that. Like that was my first step. But that's just the very initial first step. That was the 0.1 release of Pages. What Pages tries to do is it tries to have a flat file bias. What does that mean? I don't want things to need to be installable. You should be able to copy paste things, should be able to copy paste code, share code with other people, and just put them in place in the right place on the file system, and it should work. This is how the web worked 30 years ago. And we lost that. We lost that simplicity of copy pasting and sharing. We're an open source community, and in open source, that's the whole idea, right? The whole idea is that you can see my code, I can see yours, you can reuse it, you can modify it, and you can make it work. It shouldn't be installable in a sense. So Pages also doesn't require a database. When you install the component, which you still need to do, there is no database table being generated. Actually, for our Joomlatools.com website, we are not using a database. We're actually using a modified version of Joomla that doesn't use a database. And you can easily connect pages with anything else. You can connect it with the file system. You can connect it with other CMSs like Strapi or Airtable or Google Sheets. If you want to learn more about that, you should check out my previous talk from April, where I gave a lot of demos that show how all that works. And notice that the link here is wrong. I'll need to change it because this is the wrong link. But anyway, so this is the idea. So what you need to remember here is that Pages is a dynamic page generator that actually goes back to the very first idea of PHP. When Rasmus created PHP, what he wanted to do was he wanted to make it easier to automatically generate HTML. Well, in this case, making it easier to automatically generate HTML from any data source, and then not only HTML, but also other formats. Let's take an example. So this is that same example again that I showed you. And when we went back, we went from static HTML to dynamic HTML to Mambo to Joomla, and you saw that each time more and more files were being added and the complexity grew. Because in Joomla 1.5, you need to create this as a component, and the component needs to be an MVC component. So there's a lot of complexity needed. In Pages, this is it. There's nothing more. It's a single file. It's dynamic. You can use PHP in here. The logic is completely separated. The data comes from a data source. That could be a database. It could be a web service. It could be the file system. It can come from anywhere. So it's data source agnostic, any data source. This is important because where the web is going is we don't want to get locked into the closed systems where the database and the application are running on a single server, and it becomes a black box. You want to be able to pull data in from different places. This is copy pastable. You don't need to install it. This piece of code here, if you would set up Pages, of course, you would need to have the web links stable in your database, but it would just work. It's also cacheable. Pages takes caching into account. Pages knows what information is being rendered on this page. It knows this based on that model information and collection definition above. So the first part in between the little dashes is not rendered on the site. This is information that Pages uses to know what it needs to do. And very important, there are no item IDs anymore, none. Pages actually doesn't use the Joomla menu manager anymore. You still can, and we'll talk a little bit about that. You still can, but the route, which is the URL that you generate for this page, you can define here. And it's just an example here. There's route page to weblinks.csv/JSON ? So this is a dynamic route. The URL for this page to render this as HTML would be /page/2/weblinks. This URL would render the HTML. But I've also told this collection to allow rendering and generating the data as CSV and as JSON. So I'm also adjusting my route. I'm adding CSV or JSON ? Basically means that this part doesn't need to be there. It's not required, but it can be there. And when it's there, Pages will know that when you do weblinks.csv, you want to have the data rendered as a CSV file. If you do .json, it will know that it's a JSON file. So what we have now is we can, by not changing any of the code, render it as CSV and as JSON. Pages does that out of the box. So how does this tie in to the MVC? Well, basically, this is a no-code MVC. You're not writing any code anymore to make the MVC work. There's a single MVC running in the background that you built this on top of that you actually don't need to be aware of. You don't need to understand how it works. It's actually quite complex, and you don't need to work with it. It's all in a single file. So what you see here is the model. So my collection is my model definition. I'm saying use this model, filter it. I only want to see the published web links, and render it as CSV or as JSON. And then you see a little bit of the template. This is the rendering of the HTML. This is just the basics, right? You can do a lot more. You can start including files. You can start including partials. You can do more filtering. there's a lot that this can do. And so I'm trying to show you the very minimal. So this took me about 10 years to build. This is the next step after Nuku Framework. Nuku Framework, the idea with Nuku Framework is it possible to create a more rigid framework? Is it possible to create Joomla components with less code? And the answer to that was yes, but the problem is that the MVC became too complex. There's only a couple of extensions and components that are being built on Nuku Framework because it was really, really hard for developers. So does Joomla Pages needs the menu manager? Not at all. And then to finish off, there is a little website that we have built in the last 3 months that shows you how Pages works, and I've put all the code online. The site is for a nonprofit in the Philippines called Agrea. It's a little bit of a pro bono project that we have done the last 3 months for Agrea to rebuild their website. You can find, this is the site, you can find it at www.agrea.ph. And you can find the code because I've open sourced the code, which you can find it on my GitHub account, which is github.com/Johan Janssens/agrea.ph. You will find a complete website that is fully built in Pages there. And if you go to the site, you will instantly feel how fast it is. It's a topic for the coming months when I will start talking about all the work done in Pages 0, 18, and 19 with all the caching. But this site is approximately 1,000 times faster than a normal Joomla site. It can render a page in the browser at approximately 1 millisecond, which is incredibly fast. There's a lot of hard work that went into this, but it works. Okay, I wish everybody a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. All yours, Steve.
You too, Johan. I'm curious. Do you know of any other projects playing in the same space? It feels like when you explain this to people, they really get it. Even again today, we get these wonderful reactions in the chat from people saying this is like Joomla 5. This is mind-blowing in terms of the possibilities. Are there other projects that are playing around in a similar space, or do you find yourself almost kind of one step ahead and having to do these demos and explanations for people to really understand where you're going with this?
Yeah, well, I try to be humble, right? Like, I hope that somebody else is also trying to do the same thing. I would actually like that other people pick up on these ideas and try to come up with similar ideas. But not really, right? So it marries a lot of different things together. What Andy is doing with Graph comes quite close, but Graph is focused primarily as flat file CMS. I'm not focused on being a CMS, right? You can use data from any CMS system and from any backend. The Agrea website is built with Joomla. It's a Joomla. It's Joomla 3, the latest 3 release, and the data simply comes from the article manager. But I'm not using the front-end component to render. If you go to the code, you will see that it's all Pages that is rendering the whole site. I'm not using a Joomla theme or a Joomla template because most of these templates are, with all the respect for all the template developers, and this is historically grown that way, too slow, right? I need to have a website that's really, really fast, specifically for the Philippines, where internet connection isn't that great. So I want to use all the legacy, but I want to be able to put a modern front end in front of it. I want to be forward compatible. Not having seen anybody try that, there is work being done in the JavaScript community around Gatsby.js, Next.js, and some of those systems. But those are static page generators for a large part. So they approach it from the idea, I'm going to generate the whole site. If you make a single change to the site, I'm going to regenerate that whole site. Pages doesn't do that. Pages goes back to the original idea behind PHP. I want to generate a single page. I want to know what's on that page so that I can cache it. And that when that content that is rendered on that page changes, I know that and I can regenerate it. So that's the case with Agrea, for example. The Agrea site knows when a new article is added, and only those parts where that new article needs to be shown will be re-rendered. All the rest will stay as is. So even when I'm making changes to the site, the whole thing remains very, very fast because only those parts are being changed.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Johan. I think we had the same reaction as last time, that people come into a presentation like this and they say, a static page generator, I don't quite get it. But by the time they listen to you for 45 minutes, light bulbs are going off in their heads, and they come away with all sorts of ideas about how they could put this to use.
Thank you. That was the idea. I tried to frame it a bit. So I hope that things are now a little bit more clear. Again, have a little look at the Agrea site. It's more complex, of course. And then just find me if you have problems or questions or you want to get started. We're going to set up the GitHub discussions on the Pages repository so that there can be a little bit of interaction there. GitHub actually announced the public release of GitHub discussions today, so I'm going to start using it there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Johan.
You're welcome.